Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Hoshin Gupta, and today we'll be discussing scaling learning algorithms towards AI.
Oops, okay. So I had suggested this paper in November or December, I think. Hang on, I don't have my big screen, so I have to move things around here. And it's called Scaling Learning Algorithms Towards AI. I guess I should point out that the paper was written in 2007, so it's really a bit dated. However, I said, well, let's just go ahead and talk about it anyway, because it's sort of interesting, still interesting in terms of concepts. That's what 15, 14 years ago. I'm just going to make a very short presentation, and then we can see what discussion comes out of it. So you may have seen the summary I sent out. I'm just going to cover that. So scaling requirements. So this is back in 2007 when deep learning was just starting to get off the ground. And so this is kind of more like an opinion article by these folks. I think you all know who Bengio is. He's from the group up in Canada. And Jan LeCun, hopefully you guys know he's famous for the fact that that he was the group that at Bell Labs worked on convolutional neural networks and showed how they could help solve image processing problems. There's a lot of very interesting YouTube video talks by him, which I encourage you to go see. It's a very interesting guy. So at that point, they were speculating about artificial intelligence and the basic point. So as I said, a lot of this is dated. I mean, you've heard people say this before, but we should basically they're saying we should consider different tasks in artificial intelligence as not individual tasks where you solve each one. You solve the vision problem, you solve the hearing problem, you solve the language interpretation problem, and the linguistic and so on and so forth. They're basically saying that if you're going to approach AI, we should make an attempt to find a way to approach all of these different tasks as part of something more general, which is the general problem of learning the basic structure of the world. And the only example we have to date of a successful way of doing that, at least humans think so, is that AI should learn in ways similar to how animals and children learn. So in other words, it's basically, I think Jan LeCun in one of his videos says that's the only example we have of how to do this kind of general learning about the world is the way that humans have developed, and we should take a page out of that. Try to understand how they do that. So the basic concept here is that any AI task that you want to solve, all of the AI tasks that you want to solve should be somehow built around some general structures or general representations, which are then reused for different tasks. And the idea is that if you think this way, these representations should be understood as a set of interrelated concepts. So that's the basic introduction. Then they say that AI learning algorithms need to be efficient in three manners. One is computational, meaning you require a small number of computations. This is because of limited memory, limited processing power. It's what I've been saying. If you can't actually do the computation quickly enough, then you're going to get eaten by the lion. So the basic point is that it needs to be efficient computationally. They talk about statistical efficiency, meaning that you should be able to learn without needing a very, very large number of examples. And you should be able to learn from a small number of examples, small number of data points, and at the same time achieve good generalization. So you need to be very efficient in extracting information. It's more than just about extraction of information, though, as we'll see in a minute. It's also about how you pose the representational structure of the system so that it actually is able to achieve this goal. And then the third thing is that, contrary to a lot of early machine learning types of things, you don't want there to be a lot of human involvement in the learning process. In other words, if somebody has to give you a huge amount of prior knowledge in order for you to learn the task, then that's not terribly efficient. You want to be able to, this whole idea of prior knowledge is going to come back in the next slide. Okay, so minimal amount of human labor. So as an example, the early versions of the Persian and other machine learning algorithms which were used to predict rainfall from satellite imagery, the early versions all had human designed features. They looked at the images, they extracted features from the data, and then they fed those features into a regression type of algorithm. Okay, so this theme will come back. In addition, learning models for AI should have the following abilities. They should provide a highly flexible way to specify prior knowledge, meaning that somehow there needs to be a large repertoire of different architectures. There are a lot of different kinds of problems you want to solve. So your representation and your AI representation, or the representation that you're using to develop AI, needs to have this large repertoire. It needs to be able to play music, solve vision problems, help you figure out what to eat and when, and whatever large repertoire of different tasks you want to do. Each of which requires different repertoire of architectures. And one of the other papers I've proposed to the group that we should be reading is some of the work of James Crutchfield, which is much more up to date than this, although from a slightly different perspective, where he talks about digital computation. So actually you get into computer science, there's a lot of work in computer science where they identify different kinds of computing machines you need to solve different kinds of problems. So there's apparently a lot of work in discrete computer science about this architecture things that I've run across and may be of interest. They claim that you need deep architectures because you'll be able to, this whole point of being able to do general learning means you need to be able to handle primitive concepts, intermediate concepts, and lots of nonlinear interactions and so on. You need to be able to handle large families of functions. The training needs to be efficient, even if you have a large number of training examples. And as we know, in the case of humans, typically you don't just give the human a huge data set and say, go learn from this data set. The human processes the data one at a time, basically. Okay, you're going to learn tennis. I throw a ball at you, you hit the ball, and it either works or it doesn't work. I throw another ball. So you're always processing information recursively. So the point is that for artificial intelligence, you also need this recursive processing mechanism. You need to be able to discover shareable concepts. So that goes back to the whole thing of the same concept should be reusable. I think of this as being analogous to the fact that if I'm trying to teach in the classroom, one of the main mechanisms I use for teaching is to use analogies. So you can think of an analogy as a shareable concept, right? You're reducing something to an abstract notion, and that abstract notion gets reused in many contexts. And if you can make an analogy to something you already feel like you understand, chances are you will feel like you understand the new concept better than if you have to come up with a completely new representation. And then the last one is very important, and a lot of other people have talked about this in the last few years, which is the ability to exploit large amounts of unlabeled data. So humans are not constantly being provided with labeled data. Of course, in the early stages when we're kids, we show the kid a ball and we say ball, and we show a picture of a ball and we say ball. Eventually, but with just a few examples, the kid gets the notion ball and starts naming it. But a lot of the learning that we actually do, so a lot of early work in machine learning involved getting people to look at images, vision processing in particular, and label them and say, is there a crosswalk in this picture? Is there a car in this picture? Is there a bike in this picture? And so on. And so that's supervised learning because you're getting people to label those things, and then you're using them to train the algorithm. And the point that a lot of people are making, particularly in the context of AI, is that you need to be able to use unlabeled data. You need to be able to look at the data and somehow do what they call semi-supervised learning, which is extract concepts and images and objects from that without the benefit of those labels. Okay. Okay, then they go on to this issue of talking about prior knowledge. By the way, stop me at any time because there are a lot of interesting concepts that we could stop and talk about at any time. Okay, so they go on to say to solve complex tasks, we must learn highly nonlinear functions with many variations. And what they mean by this is that unlike a linear function where the derivative is constant over the domain of the function, complex tasks, they claim, have a highly nonlinear, and they have derivatives that change magnitude and even sign quite often. So you've got functions that are very nonlinear and the derivatives change around. Okay, so that's how they're characterizing complex tasks. There are lots of different ways that people characterize complex tasks, but in the context of this paper and the work that they've been doing, I've seen this theme over and over again. They think of it in terms of the derivative variations in the derivatives. The next thing they point out is that every learning model contains restrictions on the class of functions that it can learn. In other words, the moment you choose a learning model, let's say you choose a convolutional neural network or a decision tree like a random forest or whatever kind of learning model you choose, it imposes restrictions. In other words, it basically then determines there's a certain class of functions that you can learn. And this basically boils down to what I've been calling the representation problem, which I've been thinking of in the context of the problem of discovery, which is that the moment you choose a representation, you completely determine the question that you can ask, the analysis you can do, and the answers that you can receive. So they're going to talk about this problem, and basically they're pointing out that the moment you choose a representation, you're actually specifying a prior. And they talk about this some more. Then they go on to talk about the fact that when you are choosing a learning model or building a learning model, there are 4 components to this, and these 4 components essentially characterize the prior knowledge, this representational foundation that you're imposing on the problem. So the first is the data representation. So the particular choice of coordinate system, the particular choice of things that we choose to measure, how we measure them, the units we measure them in, whether we pre-process them to do feature extraction and so on, that's all called the data representation. Next is the machine architecture. That's the family of functions that the machine can implement. As you all know, there's a lot of work on artificial neural networks suggesting that this family of functions is very general. Of course, it has certain smoothness and continuity assumptions built into it, and locality assumptions and so on. So in principle, this set of functions that can be implemented by an artificial neural network is quite general. But anyway, it's still a prior. The loss function, the way we define what is closeness between the prediction and the target, or the way we define similarity, the way we define closeness, I guess. That loss function is a kind of prior because it's basically saying, how do I measure closeness? What's important? What are the things when I'm looking at two images and I want to say these images are very similar? Basically, I'm making an explicit statement about what things I'm focusing on and what things I'm going to ignore. So you might say that I want to ignore the background and just focus on the object in the image. So your loss function would be tailored to that. On the other hand, your loss function could easily focus on the background and ignore the object in the image and any variations of this. And then finally, the prior or the regularizer, the regularizing term, or the regularizing conditions you impose on the problem, which basically says if you've got you've got families of functions, you've got a family of functions, is there a particular kind of functional form that is preferred if I don't give you any data? So in the absence of knowledge, what is my best guess about how to approach this task? So that's your prior. Or if I'm choosing between two families of functions that both give me similar performance, which one do I prefer? You can liken this to the discussion between machine learning and physics-based representations, where a physicist will say, I prefer a representation that's physically interpretable, whereas the machine learning person might say, yeah, but it doesn't perform as well as the one which is using this general family of functions. So your physically interpretable representation may not be the best representation of the system. I don't want to get into that discussion right here, but I'm just trying to point that out as there tends to be preferences about the class of functions. And that preference is expressed as a prior. And then I just added this, it's not in the paper, but basically pointing out that your prior can involve domain knowledge, right? Things that you know about in the world. So for example, if you're taking a remote sensing satellite image and you're saying that these are cirrus clouds, and these are stratiform clouds, and these are a different kind of clouds, and you're identifying those features, you're imposing domain knowledge. And then there can be aspects that reflect modern culture or practice, for example, the preference for physics-based representations or representations that conserve mass or representations that are causal as opposed to correlational. These are all aspects of what I'm going to call modeling culture or practice. Any thoughts, questions, discussion about this issue of specifying prior knowledge? Nope. Okay. They don't get into a lot of detail about this, but they do point out something that we've talked about in previous meetings of this group, that a fundamental way to specify this prior that they're talking about over there is the kind of stuff that Stephen has talked to us about, which is you specify the programming language in which you express the function. So this is the computer science or algorithmic information theory context. And so once you've specified the programming language, which is essentially equivalent to specifying the representational language that we're going to use, the set of symbols, what they mean, the alphabet, how you construct words, how you construct sentences, and so on, and then how you build that into an algorithm so you can do computing, right? So you can choose different languages, and there's been some discussion. Uwe and Ben and Stephen wrote a paper in the debates thing on this. And then the idea is, this goes back to Solomonov and Kolmogorov and Chaitan, that if you do that, once you specify the programming language, which is can be run on and you can specify a program that can be run on a Turing machine, You can then favor functions that have low Kolmogorov complexity in that language, meaning that they end quickly. They're much shorter programs. So this is the description length concept. And the idea there is that low complexity, the different concept of complexity is associated with high probability. At the same time, low complexity is associated with shorter description lengths. And so the whole point there is you want methods for achieving compact descriptions of regularities in data. This gets into the whole data compression idea. And you're basically saying a model is a compression of the information in the data, a number of sufficient statistics. And then they go on to point out that in practice, this approach can be difficult to implement. Now, this is back in 2007. A lot of people have been working on this problem. We haven't talked about it too much yet, but there's a lot of work on the minimum description length principle and whether it's possible to measure the description length associated with a representation in a particular. I'll just point out that one of the reasons why I think we should talk about James Crutchfield's work is that he goes on to point out that different languages are more ideally suited to compact representations of different kinds of problems. And if you think about it, that's exactly what we do in mathematics. We invent a whole kind of mathematics which allows us to study a problem which is perfectly suited to that particular problem. Another way of saying it is that in that particular language, you have a minimum description length representation which allows you to understand that problem. So this idea that you could actually just specify the programming language and then look for the shortest description length in that language is a little bit suspect in the sense that if you choose a different language, so a different problem might have a different representation in which it's the shortest description length. And so that's an idea that a lot of people have been discussing in the literature. Any questions about this idea of description length?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, okay. A little bit louder, please.
Sure. Sorry, I'll turn my microphone up. So here are we assuming that we're holding something, what are we holding constant across these? What we were talking about comparing, we're saying that the predictive power or the accuracy is constant and we're comparing description lengths, because I guess I'm thinking of, languages where it says something like Python, where we can express something really, really compactly, but then,
yes.
You can use another method that can take advantage of like a C library that will carry out the computation much faster, but will be much more verbose. So is that what we're talking about?
So is that Dan who's talking? I can't see. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So as you yes, if once you've specified the language, then you're looking for a representation in that language which is minimum description length, and then if you have two representations which have the same performance, you're going to choose the one which is shorter. That's what you just said, right?
So we're holding performance constant.
If you're comparing two different representations, yes.
Okay.
So this would be the same idea in maximum likelihood, that if you have two explanations, both of which give equal performance, you would choose the simpler representation. That would be the principle of parsimony, correct? Do we agree on that part? Is that Dan?
Yeah, I was just trying to get it clear in my head. I wasn't contesting.
Okay.
Anything. So yeah, I'm clear on that. Thanks.
The point I was making, which is not in this paper, what I was saying, that what James Crutchfield was saying was, once you've chosen a programming language, that's true. And other people have said that, well, the difference between one programming language and another programming language is the dictionary length, and that's just a constant. So they proposed ignoring the dictionary length. But what Jim Crutchfield is pointing out, which is not in this paper, but I think we should come back to it at a future point of discussion, is he's saying that it's not just a matter of the length of the dictionary. It's that certain representations, certain alphabets, certain dictionary representations actually make, if you use that particular dictionary, the description length can be very, very long compared to a different dictionary where the description length can be very, very short. And that can depend on the problem. In other words, the dictionary itself is not universal, that you may have to match your dictionary to the problem itself. And that throws another wrinkle into this idea. So it's not as simple as saying, I'm going to use a sun-centric view of the universe instead of an earth-centric view in order to do my computations of orbital motions. It's also about what geometry I fundamentally use. Yeah. Whether I'm allowed to use polar coordinates versus, I don't know, I'm making that up, but there's something about this idea which is not clear that has been completely well resolved. Okay? At least that's how I understand it. Okay. The next thing they go on to talk about is the distinction between what they call broad priors and strong priors. And this notion of broad priors is very interesting. I think it's something that they've worked on a lot over the last decade and a half. So the distinction they make are strong priors are defined as ones that are task specific. That means they help you solve a specific task, but they don't necessarily help you solve a general task. So a specific type of prior knowledge that gives very high probability or low complexity to a very small set of functions. You decide that your set of functions, your functions are linear or logistic or whatever they are, and once you've chosen, you're restricted to those. And they only work in the context of that set of tasks, and then you can't take that learning and generalize it. Whereas a broad prior, they define as things that are related to what they call the general structure of the world. So these are things which are not ideal to a particular problem, but which can be used to solve a wide variety of problems in the world. So they give moderately high probability to a wider set of relevant functions. They cover a large subset of tasks within the AI set. And then they go on to define the AI development task as the problem of discovering what these broad priors are, which can be expressed using simple description or compact descriptions, and that which somehow still greatly reduce the space of accessible functions in appropriate ways. And you can basically think, if you're asking me, what do they mean by a broad prior? I would argue, I think that what they mean by a broad prior, they talk about later, is a deep learning architecture, is a broad prior. So we're going to get into that a little bit. So they give an example of the fact that when we design a CNN is a very specialized architecture within an artificial neural network. So CNN is really just an artificial neural network, but the difference is that a convolutional neural network makes some assumptions about locality and extensibility of a particular object. It assumes some kind of locality, space-time locality assumptions. And as a result, you reduce the connectivity links, the number of connectivity links, the number of parameters that you have to solve is much fewer. You share those parameters across the image, and it allows you to do a much better task at visual pattern recognition than just using a very general artificial neural network structure. And then also the connectivity structure, and then the deep layered structure. So they're giving this as an example of what they call a broad prior.
Hoshin?
The hope is,
Hoshin?
yes.
Are you aware of any software where you can basically start from a general purpose ANN that then develops through training to, for example, a CNN, which would be the kind of general purpose model that was mentioned at the beginning?
I'm not aware if anybody has done that. Presumably, you might be able to demonstrate you could learn that by putting very strong regularization on the problem. But you could argue that the moment you've chosen a CNN architecture, that's a very strong regularization. So your question, I think, is can you learn that regularization by some more general principle, right?
Exactly, or the initial ANN could turn into an LSTM, given the data require it.
Right.
But so far, we still make that prior choice.
Yeah, that's a good question. How would you go from an ANN to a unrolled in time network? That's a very interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. I could imagine more, it's easier to imagine going from a general ANN architecture to a CNN architecture. But off the top of my head, I don't have a very strong idea about how you would collapse it like that. I mean, you'd have to put very strong L1 type norms, for example, so that you force a lot of the parameters to be zero, right? Because you basically the difference between a general ANN and a CNN is that the vast majority of the links have been removed. Yeah. So good question though. Yeah. Don't know. Okay. They also go on to make this comment that there's no reason to believe that a smoothness prior should have any special status, because I guess people have been saying, that the assumption that the world is smooth, that your functional representation needs to represent smooth things, they claim is not necessarily a good assumption. It applies in some cases, but not in general cases. And because the problem with smoothness is it assumes very strong locality, and a lot of the problems that we solve require us to take knowledge from one domain and apply it completely somewhere else in space and time. So smoothness may or may not apply. And also the other implication of smoothness is that the derivatives can change very rapidly. So you can have abrupt thresholds and things like that. That's my interpretation of what they mean by smoothness, but they don't actually go into much detail that I recall. So then they say one important kind of broad prior is what they call the deeply layered architecture. And so really this is what they're arguing for. The idea is that deep representations require that the function you're going to learn is expressible as composed of simpler functions in many layers. So in other words, this brings in the concept of levels of abstraction, and you're all familiar with this in the convolutional neural network context, which the idea is you learn simpler functions, then compose them to learn more abstract concepts, and so on. So the contrast between shallow and deep architectures is they claim that the best way to think of shallow architectures is there's something like what you would call template matchers. So basically, they have an input layer. So you've got an input layer, then you've got a set of features in the middle layer, and those are what they're calling the templates. And then you take those templates that you've learned, or the features that you've learned, and you just do a linear combination of them. And so that's the linear output layer. Okay, so that's the general structure of a shallow network, and they're referring to these things over here as the templates. And the analogy over there, I think, is that, for example, we say that you can take a nonlinear function and you can comprise it of a polynomial expansion. So you've got a constant, a linear component, a second order component, a third order component, a fourth order component, fifth order component. And the parameters are telling you what's the strength of matching that template. The template is it a constant, is it linear, is it second order, is it third order, and so on. Similarly, wavelet transforms can be thought of as templates. You put templates on the data, and then you measure the correlational strength of different parts of the data with that template. Radial basis functions are template matchers. Frequency decomposition into sine and cosine terms of different amplitudes and different wavelengths can be thought of as template matchers. Okay, so that's a standard way that we've developed to solve complex problems by decomposing them into components which are the basis functions of templates. They then point out that there were sort of three stages. This is more like a historical development. 3 stages in the development of shallow architectures. The first level you can think of as perceptrons, where the first layer were not learned. So the templates were not learned. They were determined by the user. So they specified that here you're going to do an addition or a multiplication or an AND operation or an OR operation or whatever it is. Okay. So in this kind of architecture, the middle layers were pre-specified by the human. Type 2 layers is and perceptrons did work very well, and kind of took machine learning into the winter of machine learning, because people pointed out that you couldn't solve some very important problems. And then people came along and said, oh, but there's a way around that. Well, we can think of the training samples themselves as the templates. We're trying to match our inputs to things that I've already specified as I want it to look like this, or I want it to look like this, or I want it to look like this. So they call those kernel machines, because basically you're saying your data is the template and you're just matching your inputs to the data. But where ANNs really took off was when they realized that instead of specifying the templates, you could put very simple basis functions that had parameters that were trainable. So this is what you and I and everyone else nowadays thinks of as standard artificial neural networks, or shallow architectures, in that now you have parameters that you can learn. So for example, a convolutional neural network, if you just think of one layer, you're now saying, I don't know what the template is. All I'm saying is it's a 3x3 grid. I'm actually going to learn the parameters at every point in that 3x3 grid. And I'm going to find the parameters that create the template. Basically, they learn the template, which then extracts valuable information from the data. I'm not sure if I did a very good job of explaining that, but if not, please ask me now. Made sense? Okay. Then they go on to point out that what they claim is the main shortcoming of template-based methods is that in complex problems, you need a very large number of templates. You need to cover every kind of behavior, because the templates are usually very simple. So you need to cover every kind of behavior. And if you've got a complex problem, you may have a lot of complexity in the system, and you may not be able to do a good job of representing that system without a huge number of templates. And the problem with a large number of templates is you then end up with needing a lot of data, a lot of training examples, because you've got a lot of parameters you need to learn. Another deficiency of these standard kernel methods is that because they're typically based on establishing correlation strength, they don't have very strongly built-in ability to select what are considered relevant input features versus irrelevant ones. Where relevant or irrelevant here refers to, do they do object recognition the same way a human being does, right? So for example, the classic example is you've got pictures of dogs and you've got pictures of cats, but the cats are all wearing bow ties, and so the image processing algorithm classifies the image as a cat just because there's a bow tie, not because there's a cat in the image. Yeah. So relevant versus irrelevant features. So deep layers are composed of many layers of adaptive nonlinear components. So now we're using those learnable components, but now we're many layers of them, structured as a cascade. Features are produced at the lower levels, which represent lower level abstractions like lines, points, crosses, and so on. Then these are combined in the next layer to form higher level features like triangles, squares, circles, and so on. And then those are combined in order to form objects, which have more complex forms. So you've got intermediate results, so you've got primitive results, intermediate results, and higher level results. And the whole point is that when we think of the world, we tend to decompose the world in this kind of layered, structured way. They also point out, and other people have talked about this since then, that when you parameterize a family of functions, you can choose between a shallow or a deep architecture. You give me a function, you can represent it by a suitably designed shallow architecture or by a very deep architecture. But the point is that the deep architecture is much more efficient for representing the vast majority of common functions. Efficient meaning a much fewer number of parameters that you have to learn, okay, and trainable. So they trade space for time, and deep architectures represent family of functions in more compact form. And I saw an interesting talk by Max Tegmark where she points out that even linear systems are better represented by deep architectures. So for example, if you're doing a matrix, you can take a linear system, and even if the activation functions are all linear at every step, and you go, well, if it's linear, I just compress it down and it's just a simple matrix multiplication. Yeah, but the number of parameters you have to learn, let's say it's a 100 by 100 matrix, is 10,000. Whereas if you represent it as an LDU decomposition or some other kind of decomposition where you do a set of operations one on top of the other, the number of actual parameters you have to learn is much fewer. So even linear systems are more efficiently represented as deep architectures than shallow architectures. And I just point to the work of Max Tegmark and his team. Also, Max Tegmark and his group have talked about the fact that there's a very strong isomorphic representation between Hamiltonians in physics, which is how you represent dynamical systems, and artificial neural network structures. They're basically very similar. And then they point out that Hamiltonians in physics, most dynamical systems in physics are not above fourth order. And so this represents a class of functions. It just turns out that the class of functions represented by deep networks tends to line up very nicely with the class of functions needed to solve physics-based problems, structure of the world. That's a different set of papers.
So Hoshin?
So, yes.
Hoshin, a quick question.
Yes.
You know, we are used to consider what we're doing in terms of there's an input, there's the network, you feed the information through the network to achieve an output. And we conclude all these things that you mentioned, that deep network architectures are more efficient and so on. So, but if we think not in this directed way, but just in terms of items connected to each other. So input, output can also become input of the same architecture. Internal states are as well an input as an output to something else. Then what does this tell us about how the world functions? I'm just trying to get rid of this sequential input-output thinking, and what we do in the middle is not part of the system, but is just a machine. But actually it's not. So what does it tell us about the world if these deep network architectures are generally more efficient than shallow networks? Does it just mean there are a lot of things interconnected and not just a few, which could be represented by linear interactions? I don't know if that leads us somewhere, but.
No, it's a very interesting problem. I'm going to assume it is the problem that people have been struggling with, which is that in the real world, you don't necessarily have inputs and outputs. You have a lot of things connected to each other. I think it makes sense that you can think of those connections in the sense of in the sense of graph structures, but it does seem to imply that that you could build those connections in a hierarchical sense, in the sense that so you could have a Bayesian network where everything is connected to everything else, and change in one affects the probabilities about another one, right? But it seems to imply that, so that would be a flat network architecture. It seems to imply that you could think of multiple layers where then you take that representation at the lowest layer and then you abstract it up, and then you abstract it up, and then you abstract it up. And now your inputs and outputs are not just inputs at the lower layer, but inputs at the intermediate layer and inputs at the higher layer. So now you have to start thinking in terms of this, for want of a better word, three-dimensional representation, where one of those dimensions is the degree of abstraction that you're imposing, right? I guess a good example of that would be I could show you all of the imagery associated with what's going on in the room, but I could also give you a piece of information which says dog or cat or whatever, right? And just that piece of information, dog or cat, which is an abstraction, would condition my interpretation of what's going on in the room, even at the more primitive levels. But I'm not sure. I mean, it's a good question. I'm not sure how to think about it
So
in
what
any
we
way,
could
because
do
we're
in
so
that
used to
sense
thinking
is,
about, yeah.
so we could, if we have a set of inputs and outputs and we establish a network and we establish perfect mapping from input to output, we could then start taking all these elements apart and taking some of them and say, now that's the input and all the rest is intermediate and we have some output, and see what connectivity structure emerges from that, and do that in a lot of different ways. So it seems to me doing that just once, and it, having each element just fulfilling one role at a time is quite restrictive. And maybe we learn something about the total interdependencies of all these elements by giving them completely different roles. And so I would assume that Praveen and others thinking in networks have a much better idea of what that means or what it helps.
Well, certainly there's the time direction, right? I mean, there's this implication of things moving. Causality has something to do with time, but maybe it also suggests why people seem to suggest that information is distributed in the brain, in storage, in the sense that in order to be able to use analogies, you have to be able to abstract in such a way that many different aspects of the world are accessible because of a shared representation somehow. And that those analogies also have to be subject to multiple levels of abstraction. You're asking a very complicated question here, I think.
Yeah, I think this one is a little difficult to address in abstract, right? I mean, as you're speaking, Hoshin, I'm trying to figure out what learning means. I mean, it's important to start with the simplest examples of the ball and the dog and the cat, but I think a lot of the learning is, I mean, that's one type of learning where you're associating a name with an object and you're kind of finding common elements of different objects. So it's a classification problem as well, right? So, but I think a lot of the AI effort is now looking into this causal inference, because the actions have consequences. So something that happens now is going to go through a sequence of steps to result into something else. And that would require a different type of learning. At least in my mind, I don't see how these would help. And I think Julia Pearl has been arguing about it for the last 5-6 years, basically saying if you want to move to the next stage of AI, you need to be able to incorporate somehow causal reasoning into AI.
And dynamics,
so in whatever shape or form they come, right? And it's still unclear to me how all this plays out in terms of the representation and so forth. So I think these are hard questions,
Yeah.
and I don't know if there is.
I think the current approach is to think of the world as static, or a set of static objects, right? And
Yeah,
the problem they're trying to solve is the static problem. But as they get into reputational learning and dealing with dynamics, presumably, if you haven't got some insight into the static problem, it's going to be very hard to deal with the dynamics and the causal issues.
for sure. That is for sure. But the question is, if we anchor all our thinking on the static problem, then we are not going to be able to generalize. And then when we to get to the next stage, we might have to just break the shackles of everything that is based on the static learning. So, I mean, I think that's a big tug of war right now.
I mean, the other thing that comes to my mind is that we know that the architecture of the brain has 3 levels at the very least, probably 4. You know, you've got primitive stimulus response type of architecture, ganglia in the body. You've got the hindbrain, you've got the midbrain, and the cortex. And each of these seems to deal with different aspects of the problem of dealing with the world. And each of them seems to deal with progressively more abstract representations, presumably, of the world. So it may be that there is some hints in the way that the human brain is structured, which will help us deal with that problem.
That's a good point, yeah.
Okay.
May I ask a quick question?
Please.
Probably first a comment. When I am thinking on the learning problem for static things, I guess this representation of this fixed representation of static things works. But for me, like if I am thinking on how a baby starts recognizing what is a cat or a dog, so it may be that the different cats looks different, but they behave similarly. So if you see a cat jumping from the window to the bed, it's more likely to be a cat. It doesn't matter the shape of the cat, and it's a cat but not a dog, right? So the behavior is what dictates, in my opinion, the nature of what it is a cat instead of the shape. So it doesn't matter if the cat has a bow tie or a leash or something else, that it might disguise their appearance, but then the behavior of the cat is what I guess ultimately defines what it is a cat.
Agreed. I would argue, though, that if I had to choose between behavior and reducing a set of pixels to an object first, I'm not going to take the pixel and look at the pixel's evolution in time. I'm probably going to first take all the pixels and reduce them to a cat, and then look at how that one object is evolving in time. Or, okay, cat's not just one object, but
right. Yes.
So we tend to first identify the object and then its behavior as a behavior of that object as being an efficient way to represent the object and then determine what it is. I suspect, anyway.
Okay. I see.
I mean, we do some kind of aggregation, some kind of abstraction very quickly, right? So this idea of reducing things to objects and relationships and behaviors happens incredibly quickly, probably, you know, in the visual sense, even in the eye, even before it gets to the brain. A lot of it's happening.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Okay. I mean, if you were a blob and an amoeba, and you were just responding to light, presumably you're not responding to individual pixels of light. You're responding to this average lightness and moving towards it, right?
Right. And you don't know if it's just the light or it's also a temperature or something else that is driving
or whatever it is.
The collection of things.
But there's some kind of reduction to something right?
Right.
And then the behavior of that thing. But again, speculation. Good question.
Right.
Okay, so Bengio and LeCun claim that most functions can be represented by deep architectures cannot be compactly represented by shallow architectures. They give some examples. There's a lot of technical stuff I've skipped through. And they claim that deep architectures can represent highly varying functions compactly because they can compose many simpler nonlinearities together. Okay. So one comment I made over here is that in some sense, the idea of locality helps to support understanding or interpretation. We like to break things up into little individual things where you can say, oh, I understand this and I understand that. But non-locality, the ability of a representation to spread across space-time, in some sense supports compact representations. And part of their argument is that compact representations may require less data to be learned if they allow for non-locality, so that you're not just looking. It's a little bit sort of hard to come up with good examples of this, but because we tend to always think in terms of identifying primitive elements in terms of local space-time. But as they point out, when we do that, we end up requiring a lot of parameters and therefore a lot of data. They also point out that training of deep architectures has been somewhat of a challenge. This is back in 2007 again, remember that, because of the problems of the loss function and local optima. And they say this problem seems particularly difficult for narrow networks or networks with symmetries where the hidden units are interchangeable. We all know this when you train an artificial neural network. If you start from different initial conditions, you can end up with completely different sets of parameters, which in some sense are all equivalent. And that's because the network allows you to have a huge amount of rotational symmetry or transformational symmetry. Again, this is very primitive, very old, dated now. Jeff Hinton proposed greedy layer-wise unsupervised pre-training as a way of training deep architectures. Hopefully you're all familiar with this. Here the idea is that you learn the first layer using some kind of auto-encoding method to compactly represent all the information in the data, and then you train the second layer from the first layer, and then you train the third layer from the second layer, and the fourth layer from the third layer, and so on. And you end up with a representation which is an initial representation of a deep network, which you can then go back in and do full deep layer backpropagation training on. So the claim is that that may be one way to get some initialization going to help solve this problem. And the resulting architecture, this is the name I was trying to think of earlier, UI, is what they call a deep belief network. Of course, there's been a lot of progress on this since 2007. But the basic idea of greedy layer-wise unsupervised pre-training, I think, is still a very important part of this. Okay, so this is concluding. They say by combining a deep architecture with a small amount of prior knowledge embedded in the architecture, with a learning algorithm that can deal with millions of examples. So what is that algorithm? That's stochastic gradient descent, where you don't have to use all the examples every time. You use a small subset of examples to learn the gradient. With a final dense layer that takes the higher level learned representation as input, in other words, the kernel machine, you end up with lower error rates. So basically at that point, they had shown that a deep network was able to give better performance than a shallow network on the same task, but was able to train faster and run faster on large data sets. So basically at this point, what you're doing is you're replacing this intermediate layer with a set of layers, hierarchical set of layers. And then you're still doing this output linear layer over here, right? So what they're calling the dense layer, or sometimes they do more than one dense layer at the end. But the basic idea is that you're still taking you're taking your input data and you're constructing a set of lower level features, intermediate features, high level features, and then those high level features are somehow combined together to do the final learning stage. So this output learning stage is exactly the same as what you're always doing with shallow networks. All that you're doing is you're expanding this intermediate part to be a set of layers where you go from detail to from less abstraction to more and more abstraction. So what basically pointing out the deep network is essentially learning the kernel, right? And it's learning a much more complicated kernel than you could learn in the past because you're doing it with depth rather than with breadth or width. Okay. And they claim that this need reduces the need for human intervention. So you're doing the learning rather than the human being. Okay, so just to recap, they said we should consider different AI tasks as aspects of the general problem of learning the structure of the world, much in the way that animals and children do. I don't know why they don't include adults in there, but that's an interesting question. All AI learning algorithms should be efficient computationally, statistically, and require minimal human involvement. So you should be able to learn on your own by direct experience of the world. You need a highly flexible way to specify prior knowledge. They argue for deep architectures as being able to handle large families of functions. They argue that we need to develop efficient methods for training so you can learn, which implies this recursive approach. You need to be able to discover shareable concepts. One of the things I didn't mention earlier is that it has been demonstrated with image processing that if you learn a deep architecture like this, which starts with primitive elements and then goes to more complex elements to more complex elements, you could train this on fruit and image processing of fruit, and then you could apply it to a completely different problem of classifying animals, or humans, or cars, or planes, or various objects, because the structures being learned at these primitive levels for doing image processing are universal. The same kind of structures are useful for identifying fruit, the same ones that are useful for identifying cars and planes and trucks and so on. So that's this idea of shareable concepts. And ability to exploit large amounts of unlabeled data, because you can use this unlabeled data to learn these primitive shareable concepts, even if they can't be used to learn the final concept. Okay. So that's my quick and dirty summary of some of the main things that grabbed my attention in that paper.
So the key point of the paper is to argue for these deep systems.
Argue for deep architectures if we
Yeah.
want to be able to learn general learning ability as opposed to specific learning ability.
Yeah, I would be interested to see if there is any follow-up work these guys might have done related to causal connections in there. I don't know. We'll have to check that out.
There are some recent YouTube videos by Jan LeCun that I sent a few out, where he's focusing now on this problem of general artificial intelligence. So there may be some stuff in there about, because they distinguish between correlation, association, and causation, right? The three levels of strength of causal relationship. Yeah.
Sorry, was that among the set that's about 3 years old? What were the years of those? Because I think after the last meeting, you had mentioned it during our last meeting, and then I followed up and watched a few of them, but I'm trying to think of, yeah, like which kind of time period are we talking?
I think they're from 2018 on, yeah. if I recall correctly. He's been giving some talks recently. Some of them are with Jeff Hinton, some are with other people, some are just on his own. Some of them mainly just reconstruct the history going back to convolutional neural networks. But I think now, a lot of these people, since about 2018 on, have been really trying very hard to think about this problem of general artificial intelligence and what kind of structures are going to be needed in order to be able to address that problem. I think you may have heard other people talk about the fact that you need, for example, intuitive physics engine, for example. So they're thinking in terms of the ways that kids learn. That one of the stages by which learning happens, and one of the early stages after we learn to identify objects is we learn to identify what they call intuitive physics. If you throw a ball, how is it going to behave? So you don't know the physical equations, you don't know the equations of motion or anything, but you know that if an object goes behind another object, if a ball rolls behind a box prior to a certain age, if the ball doesn't come out the other side, the kid doesn't show any surprise. But after a certain age, they get very curious. Why didn't the ball come out the other side? So they're expecting a certain kind of behavior. And he shows a very interesting video where somebody is working with a chimpanzee, or is it an orangutan? You remember that video? And he puts an object in a cup, and then he stealthily takes the object out and he shows the cup to the orangutan, and the orangutan looks inside and then falls on the ground laughing because it expects the object to be in there. So they're trying to use these kind of concepts to help argue for a developmental structure for general AI.
I have a question also. So about this question of causality. So I think Professor Kumar brought up Pearl. Maybe last year there was a really interesting set of lectures by Richard McElreath. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's updated this set of lectures, and it's I think he's more in the biological sciences, but it very much gets into that question of causally oriented statistical tools. I don't know if you've heard of that, but Richard McElreath.
No, could you send that name out?
Yeah,
that would be very interesting.
Yeah, and I guess my question was because the point of this is talking about impose, or I guess one of the points made is how structure is imposed, right, by choosing whatever framework, is that sort of the same thing, like this idea of the DAG, the directed acyclical graph, or that's I mean, when I'm looking at this paper that was just sent, the neural network zoo. There's these really great illustrations. It was just sent in the chat. I don't know if anyone has opened that yet, but
I just opened it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to me, trying to put a problem, something like object permanence, like, okay, there's some simple examples where you can look at causality and maybe make a simple graph from it, but to me it quickly becomes very counterintuitive, and it's like, I guess that's the problem with it for me. In reading some of Judea Pearl's work, it just goes over my head really quickly because I don't think that format is that intuitive to me, but I think this idea of, like, having models to build really quickly to basically test sensitivity, right, to close or shorten the feedback loop of changing a parameter and seeing the dynamics of a system change really, like, much faster than real time. I think that I just think of those things as very similar as a learning process. I don't know.
Oui.
Just a quick thought, also following on what Dan said. I'm wondering whether we split, the continuum, the world, into a series of domains in a way that upstream there was always a strong signal where we could follow causality very easily. So we split the hydrological domain. It starts where the rain is, and then we know it causes all the further action. We don't split it, say, at soil moisture and then model evapotranspiration, because it tends to, weather has a lot of different causes, not only local evapotranspiration. So then it becomes hard to detect or to pursue the causality signal from local evapotranspiration to the feature called weather. And I wonder if that also determines, say, the structures of the networks that we use, because we tend to, have at the left and the right end things that are connected by strong causality, while in the middle of the network, the signal might be blurred or spread over many different neurons or elements, but we are typically not placing that at the beginning. So I'm still struggling around with what I said previously, that why not start somewhere else in the process and look what happens?
I tend to think that, yeah, I mean, if you look at the way we tend to look at the world, we tend to simplify, right? And we like to isolate little objects and study them and make strong assumptions that they're not connected in order to just study that little object. And then we seem to think of learning becoming more sophisticated as being somehow then being able to combine those objects together and then revise our representation to represent the complexity and so on. I wonder if one thing which is being not completely recognized here is that in addition to abstract levels of reasoning, which would imply building a second neural network using the first neural network as its data, right? And then you could build another network on top of that using the second network as its data. But even within our brain networks, we seem to have, this is going back to what you were saying, Dan, we seem to have this mechanism where we're constantly growing new connections and losing connections. And that ability to grow connections and lose connections, where the connections are not just layer to layer to layer, but you can connect any neuron at any level to any other neuron at any other level, perhaps limited by some kind of locality, is not something that I see built into our current architectures. So this ability to actually grow complexity of representation doesn't seem to be represented in the directed acyclic graph representation. Or, we don't allow loops to form, for example, or other kinds of things to form very much.
Yeah, I think some of that field is advancing pretty quickly. I just posted a link in there which I came across yesterday, but I haven't read that article yet. But there's a figure that is quite intriguing in there. I think it's the second figure. Yeah,
This
that one. Yeah.
Researchers build AI that builds AI. Well, there's been a lot of talk about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the really compelling parts of the LeCun talk, the ones that I've seen, are the comparisons. You get these really great visual comparisons of the what is it called, like the sample efficiency of different neural network architectures versus child or human learning. And that, I mean, I kind of heard of it, but until I saw that, it was just really compelling. But when I think about kind of yeah, the examples, or okay, so they're talking about like learning certain games, right? So for the latest Alpha Zero or whatever to achieve, like even a basic performance on some 2D or 3D video game, it takes like some factor, orders of magnitude more time. And that's one really compelling argument. But then I guess, then I think about other examples like when we exercise, well, how long it takes us to develop judgment, because our frontal lobe doesn't develop until our 20s as humans. So okay, so that, I mean, does the other structure like this AI making AI sounds like a brain, eventually growing this other
Sure.
component, this other feature or physical part. But yeah, so I guess to me is it really that like the example set, is it really that small? And I don't know how that's really evaluated. So I don't really have a concept of, okay, yes, like a human will take a video game and learn in 15 minutes to play some game, but does that counting everything else that's occurred in that 25-year-old's life? I'm not sure if that's been accounted for. And so that's something that I think about when I see that example.
Yeah, I agree. I think the prior knowledge that's embedded in a child's brain is a lot more than the prior knowledge that we have figured out how to embed in an AI system at this point. So I think it's going to be a long time before that comparison, or it's going to be a little while at least before that comparison is a fair one. The interesting thought is that in principle, an AI will eventually have access to more memory and processing power than the human brain. And perhaps in principle will not need to sleep. So you could imagine an acceleration of that learning process, but probably it would take time. So would it take 20 years that it takes for a kid to develop to being a young person? I don't know, maybe. The difference is that once you developed that certain amount, I guess the interesting question would be, once you develop that certain amount of prior knowledge, could you just copy it over to another one easily? With human beings, we don't have that ability. We have to kind of learn it from each other, which is a training process as opposed to just being able to download the contents of your consciousness, your brain, and into a new neural architecture.
And I guess is that part of the strength of human intelligence is that, getting to all those points is very, it's very different. And so you're not caught, everyone doesn't have the same copy of
Right.
how to do something. And
good point. Are you guys familiar with Max Tegmark's Life 1, Life 2, Life 3 concept? I think Uwe turned me on to this. So Life 1 is primitive organisms. You have hardware and you have software, right? So hardware is the neural architecture. Software is the ability to program that neural architecture. So Life 1 is primitive organisms. They had hardware and the software which determined their behavior, which is the behaviors encoded into that hardware. But they could not change their hardware or their software. So learning proceeded at the rate of evolution. So random mutations cause changes in the parameters of the system, which causes learning to occur. Life 2 is human beings and animals and so on. The idea is that we don't have the ability to change our hardware, but we do have the ability to reprogram our software. So we can learn through experience. So he imagines life 3 as being the next development, where not only can you reprogram the software, but you can redesign your own hardware. And that's what he's imagining as the next level of life. So that if you wanted to go to another planet and be in a harsh environment, you could engineer the machine that runs your software to be able to survive in that environment. More to the point with this paper is you could actually redesign your hardware to be optimal for solving a particular problem. So you're reprogramming your hardware and your software, which is not an ability that human beings have. So an interesting idea that he's proposing. So this is sort of like software can write software now. They're starting to do that, but software can actually redesign the hardware that it's going to run on. So your next generation of Apple computers, some years from now, will have been designed by Apple computers. Just picking Apple out of a hat.
Is
But
that
they
sort of what's
seeing
happening?
that.
Sorry, I was reading about architectures for quantum computers. Is that sort of happening there?
Haven't heard of that, don't know, but possibly, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think we're still dealing with this representational problem, right? How do we choose the optimal representational architecture? And I mean, to me, this begs the question, is there a general representational architecture and all others are subsets of that? Or are there truly different languages, encoding mechanisms, which are not part of some general language or encoding mechanism? It's so hard for me to think of that because I'm so trained to thinking of everything as being a special case of some more general case. So I don't actually know if it's possible, if thinking that way makes sense at all. But it wouldn't make sense, presumably, for nature to have invented a biological organism that could live on any planet, because that would be inefficient. So it created a particular architecture which works for this planet, and it would presumably create a different architecture, hardware, for a different planet, or a different set of a different environment. Well, we've gone past an hour and a half. Stephen, did you have any thoughts about the idea of the language encoding mechanism? We should probably come back to that at another point, but this hope. Yeah.
So I got the time zones mixed up and I entered 1 hour into the discussion.
Okay.
So I don't have my thinking completely settled at this point.
Okay. We should get to those Crutchfield. We should get to the Crutchfield paper at some point.
Yeah.
See what he means by that. But you know, I don't. As you know, my interest is in this whole representational problem. But please don't let me sidetrack any interesting other discussions that this group wants to have. I will point out though that so Leela turned me on to James Crutchfield, and there's this interesting talk from 2018 where he talks about transfer entropy. And have you seen that one, Leela? I can send out the link.
No. Yes, please.
But he talks about how using information theory as the framework helped lead to thoughts about transfer entropy and about synergy and what's the other term? Synergy and where neither X nor Y contains information about Z, but X and Y together contain information about Z. That's
Redundancy.
synergy. Redundancy, right? these other concepts. Or, for example, he gives an interesting example where he says you've got the past and the future connected by the present, but you could have information from the past going to the future which doesn't go through the present. And what the heck does that mean? Right? And that just comes out of a result of drawing a Venn diagram. So anyway, do we have a volunteer for the next meeting?
Yes, we actually have Stephanie. She was willing to present her work at any point. So we were discussing that today, and she's willing to present in the next meeting. So we can take a little bit more of time to read and digest Crunchfield and probably have it in the next one. And in the meantime, we can have Stephanie presenting her thesis, her work during the PhD.
Okay. I just want to mention that this direction I've been going is sort of, I mean, it is information theory, but it's at a very abstract level. So I don't want to pull everybody into that if there's other more interesting aspects of information theory itself, which are more practically applicable to our problems that we want to discuss. So people should bring those up. All right. It was nice seeing you guys. I'll be in touch with you, Stephen. We'll try to have a discussion about Crutchfield at some point.
Well, yeah, I'll watch the video part of today that I missed and let you know any thoughts I have. Yeah.
Okay. I just basically summarized what was in that outline I sent. So.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.